have to do with Moldova, Transnistria, and have to do with Poland. And a second front perhaps is forming, whether it's Poland to the west or Romania, Moldova, Transnistria to the west. What do you make of these rumors, claims? One of the claims is coming from Sergei Narushkin, so a pretty reliable statement from a pretty reliable guy making a statement like what he made with regards to Poland. Um, and then you have Moldova and Transnistria as well. So,
Yeah.
what do you make of what's going on?
They're not rumors at all. They're real dangers. I mean, I think this is a very, very dangerous situation. The first thing to say is, why is this happening? Well, the reason it's happening is because even the West is now starting to accept that the situation in Ukraine is going badly wrong. The British Defence Ministry published a statement yesterday which effectively admitted that Ukraine is losing ground in eastern Ukraine and is suffering heavy losses. I mean, they try to package it, but the British Defence Ministry has always taken a positive spin on the war. They're now starting to realise things are not going to plan at all. And we now hear all kinds of reports that the situation in Azovstal is now on the brink of collapse. We're hearing, that the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians out of Kherson region, that they're gaining ground in Kharkiv region, that they're getting closer again to the center of Kharkiv city, something which we haven't heard about for a long time. And we're getting more and more reports that the Ukrainian forces in Donbass are not just retreating, but that they are suffering very heavy losses as well. So suddenly there's been this huge shift and darkening of mood, and that now is leading to all sorts of very dangerous ideas about opening up second and third fronts. Now, in relation to Moldova, I mean, we had all those incidents, those attacks on installations in Moldova, but we've now had Arestovich, the Ukrainian spokesman, who's been openly saying that Moldova and Ukraine should get together to roll up Transnistria. The Moldovan government, Maria Sandu, who's the president, is very upset, seems to be genuinely upset about this. She said that Moldova doesn't have a proper army. It's looking for a peaceful solution to the problem of Transnistria. There are no Romanian troops in Moldova, despite claims to the contrary. I got the impression that she's very, very rattled, does not want to be swept along into this second front idea in Moldova and Transnistria. I think she fears a response from the Russians, and I think she also is worried that ultimately Moldova might be simply disappeared as a result of this conflict, which would leave no position ultimately for her. So that comes from Maria Sandu. The fact that the Moldovan government apparently doesn't want to become involved doesn't mean that it isn't going to happen. And we now have reports that Ukraine, in the middle of a war, is actually going to hold military exercises near Moldovan territory, which, I mean, to me, it gives a clear indication that Ukraine is now seriously thinking about opening up some kind of front against Transnistria. And as for the situation further north in western Ukraine, we had this report from Narishkin, who is the head of the SVR, which is Russia's foreign intelligence service, that the Poles are thinking of sending troops into western Ukraine, that they discussed it with the Americans in March, that the Americans gave a kind of stuttering green light, saying to the Poles, well, if you do it, you can do it, but, don't expect us to become involved, which the Poles will certainly treat as a green light. And instead of Warsaw, of the Polish government coming out and saying strongly that all these claims coming out from Moscow about a Polish move on Western Ukraine are false and have no basis in fact, what we get from Warsaw is nothing of any consequence except reports that the Polish military is going to start big military exercises in the east and either the north or the south of the country, depending on which reports you read. So I don't think we can talk about these as being rumors. They look to me, on the contrary, as genuine threats And one would like to think that the Western powers would act to stop them. But on the contrary, all the indications are that the situation in both Transnistria and Moldova and in Western Ukraine is now sliding out of control.
It seems like the United States is kind of sitting back and just watching to see what exactly Poland and Moldova will do. Or I don't even want to say Moldova. Arestovich and Ukraine will do vis-a-vis Moldova, because it seems like they're the ones that are trying to egg on Moldova into this. And then we have to take a look at Romania and what Romania is going to do. So it seems like the United States is kind of keeping their options open there without committing to anything, because if Poland should go in, or if something does get started in Moldova and say Romania makes a move, the United States could either jump in on the action if they see things going well, or cut those countries off and just say, we don't know what Poland was thinking. We don't know what Moldova or Arestovich or Romania was thinking. They're just kind of saying, yeah, Poland, that's an interesting idea. Maybe you want to explore it, but don't expect anything from us. But who knows? Maybe if you're doing well, maybe we'll take you up on your offer and also join in, or maybe NATO will join in as well. They're very much keeping their options open, and they're letting some ideologues, people that are clearly obsessed with Russia, ramp things up to a point where things could go terribly wrong.
Yes, you're absolutely right. That's exactly my own view. That the US is drifting. It's allowing the situation to drift towards a crisis, and a more reckless and stupid approach to this, it's difficult to imagine. Because, of course, if we have a situation where, let us say, there's a conflict in Moldova involving Ukraine, I mean, that is going to obviously extend the war, and that's going to be very, very bad. And it's almost guaranteed in that case to mean that we will start to see Russian moves further west, not just to Nikolaev, to take Nikolaev and Odessa, but further still to link up with the people in Transnistria and Moldova itself. And of course, if the Romanian army becomes involved, which is a NATO army in Moldova, and the Russians start launching missile strikes against it, which they can certainly do, what does the United States do in that case? And the same applies to an equal degree if the Poles move into Western Ukraine, to Lviv. What do the Ukrainians, how do the Ukrainians respond to that? The Ukraine has had a difficult history with Poland. The Poles have irredentist claims to this region. Will the Ukrainians be happy to see the Poles move in? Or will they be, on the contrary, very alarmed about it and say to themselves, well, this is a land grab by Poland at our expense? Will they resist the Poles, or will they support them? And as for the Russians, they have made it very clear again that they're not going to be happy to see Polish troops in Western Ukraine. I personally interpret Putin's comments in St. Petersburg the other day, when he talked about lightning strikes, the fact that they came out just before Narishkin and the SVR released this report as a clear sign from Putin that the Russians, far from welcoming a Polish move into Western Ukraine, are on the contrary committed to responding against it. So let us say that these Polish troops go into Western Ukraine. Let's say that the Russians strike them with hypersonic missiles, with Kinzhal missiles, and with other Zircon missiles, which the Russians now have in increasing numbers and to which there is no counter. What do the Poles do in that case? Do they take casualties? Do they run to the US? Do they say to the US, help us? What does the US do? If Poland and Romania send their armies into Moldova and Western Ukraine, and if their troops, the Polish and Romanians, start to suffer heavy casualties in these places because of Russian hypersonic missile strikes, and the US does nothing and says to the Poles and the Romanians, well, it was all, you decided this, you sort it out for yourself. What effect is that going to have on US credibility in Poland and Romania? What will the governments in Warsaw and Bucharest think about the support they are getting, or in that case, not getting from the United States? And in the alternative, if the US feels it has to support its allies in Moldova and Western Ukraine, does that mean it's prepared to send troops and aircraft assets into these regions and take on the Russians head to head? I mean, this is a catastrophe. And the US, far from letting it drift, ought to be doing everything it possibly can. It ought to be talking to the government in Warsaw, to the government in Bucharest, and telling them, do no such thing. But of course, the old man in the White House is not thinking about any of that, and the hardliners around him are fixated with defeating Russia.
Yeah, I mean, I just think their attitude is let's see what a little more chaos does to the region. I think that's like the position they're taking is, let's have a little more chaos, and who knows, maybe it'll distract Russia, maybe it'll provide that second and third front to further weaken Russia. That is, after all, now the stated goal, according to Lloyd Austin. The stated goal is how do we weaken Russia? So if they have a second or third front, if Romanian soldiers or Moldovan or Polish soldiers die, it doesn't really matter for the United States, because if they can have a prolonged insurgency or a second and third front that eats up more of the Russians' military personnel and Russian money and assets and all kinds of things, well, then for the neocons, it's a win. That's kind of what they want, and I think that's why they support a guy like Arestovich, because he's a provocateur. He's sinister. He's much more sinister than Zelensky. He's smarter than Zelensky, but he's also the Baghdad Bob of this conflict. He's a complete BSer from top to bottom. So to have him hanging around and just kind of poking around and provoking things kind of serves the neocons really, really well in this scenario. And I think Moldova, on a final note, I think Moldova is an interesting option for the neocons and for the Biden White House, because it's a conflict that's kind of got NATO in there and kind of doesn't. So once again, the U.S. can kind of take a hands-on or hands-off position with Moldova.
Yes, I think you are summing up neocon thinking exactly correct. But what you're doing at the same time is exposing the ultimate fallacy of neocon thinking. Because I think the neocons, in the way that they always do, they think that everything is a chess game, that they can play chess with Russians, with Romanians, with Ukrainians, with the Moldovans, and with the Poles, and somehow the US will come out the winner and Russia will be weakened, and all of this. It is far more likely that expanding the war in this kind of way is going to create situations in Western Ukraine and in Moldova in which the United States is going to be faced with incredibly difficult choices. Does it go into these regions and support its troops, the Romanian and Polish troops, in other words, its allies? Or does it let them, as you correctly say, hang in the wind? Now, if it does the first, then of course the danger is not that Russia will be weakened. The danger is that the United States will become overextended and drawn into another forever war, which will this time be against the Russians, and where there's always the danger of nuclear war hanging over the horizon, and where, to be straightforward about it, the Russians always have the advantage because, as Obama so wisely said all those years ago, in this part of the world, they have escalation dominance. So it's a very bad idea if you decide to intervene. But if you don't intervene, if the Poles and the Romanians are badly beaten up, if they have to retreat back into their own countries, what happens? What happens to Western Ukraine and Moldova in that case? Does Russia absorb them? Does it impose puppet states, puppet governments there? What does it do? But beyond that, what happens in Bucharest and Warsaw? Will they say, well, the US betrayed us, it let us down? Are we going to be very angry with the US? Are we going to start seeing political moves in these two countries, which might not be in the US interest. And of course, on top of that, if you extend the war, you're going to have all sorts of angry and violent people circulating all around Europe, Central Europe, Eastern Europe. It's already going to happen anyway to some extent. This is going to make that even worse. And of course, that will make the situation in Europe itself, the whole of Europe, increasingly unstable. So you've described perfectly the neocon mindset. This is a clever way of weakening Russia. In fact, it's more likely to present the United States with strategic choices it needs to avoid, and to put the US in a position where it could lose and lose badly, and where its position in Europe might be undermined. So I think you've described the neocon thinking exactly right, but the dangers and risks are huge, as they always are with all of these neocon projects, which are never fully or properly thought through.
Outside of opening up a second or third front in Moldova or Poland, and the fact that any type of ceasefire or surrender has been conclusively ruled out by the U.S. and the U.K. For Zelensky, what other options are there for this Ukraine project? I don't see any outside of having Poland or Romania, Moldova get involved. I
Well,
mean,
well,
unless
well,
I'm missing something.
you're not missing anything. You've got it exactly right. That's the trap they've now fallen into, because, of course, they've told the Zelensky regime, don't negotiate, don't even think about negotiating, don't make any kind of concessions. You're going to go on fighting until you win, something which is impossible. And we said at the start of this program that, in fact, Ukraine is losing. And of course, at the same time, you've got to try and translate this impossible position, this doctrinaire position of not negotiating and not seeking a peace. You've got to try to find some way of preventing the far greater disaster of a defeat. So what do? You come up with these dangerous ideas, very dangerous ideas, of sending Romanian forces into Moldova, Ukrainian forces into Moldova, Polish forces into Western Ukraine, starting to open second and third fronts, even though one can easily see how a Polish advance into Western Ukraine might even set Ukraine and Poland off against each other. It's not impossible, but you do that. And of course, the other thing you do is what neocons always do in this situation, which is throw money at the problem. So, we've already gone through $3.5 billion of aid to Ukraine. So now we're going to send $33 billion of aid to Ukraine. This to a country whose pre-war GDP was $150 billion. We're going to pour money into Ukraine at this vast rate. Make Ukraine into Afghanistan. Was it $1 trillion they sent into Afghanistan? What good did that all do? But that's, again, very much the neocon mindset. You throw money at the problem, you throw weapons at the problem, you create all these problems in the region with other countries, you create a disaster. It turns out bad for the US, for the United States. It turns out bad for the world. It's a catastrophe for Europe. But of course, the neocons as individuals, always what happens is they walk away. They can all walk away from every disaster and then start to think up the next one. And that is the consistent pattern. So from their point of view, you can see the thinking. And if it all goes wrong, well, don't worry, because we can try it again somewhere else.
Yeah. Final question. Do you think that Russia is prepared for either one or even both of the scenarios to take place?
Yes, I think they are, is the short
Because
answer.
both could happen.
Absolutely, they could both happen. I mean, very interesting to see how it works out. As I said, what Poland and Ukraine do with each other, and how Moldova reacts. But I'm sure that the Russians are preparing as we speak for all of these scenarios. And bear in mind, it's going to take several weeks to get all the troops in place, to get all the pieces moving in Moldova and and Western Ukraine. Certainly in Moldova, it will probably take less time, but we'll see how it all works out. By that point, the military situation in Ukraine will have evolved further. And what I'm hearing is Ukrainian losses on the battlefield are simply, well, somebody put it, unsustainable. And I'm sure that's true. So we'll see how that works out.
Yeah. Even the media that was saying Zelensky was going to march into Moscow just 2 weeks ago, they're even starting
I know.
to realize that this is
I,
falling apart
I've
for them.
noticed the same. As I said, suddenly we've gone from triumphalism to increasing worry and concern. But as you correctly say, what they do in this situation is, instead of actually doing what they should be doing, encouraging Ukraine to sit down and negotiate peace, they double down with these reckless ventures in Moldova and Western Ukraine. And as I said, throwing $33 billion to a country which, you don't throw that kind of money at a country with a GDP which before the war was $150 billion. It's probably more likely $70 billion now, half the GDP. You're going to destroy the country. When you throw that much money in, it will destroy the country. It will mean nobody wants to do anything productive because the money is pouring in and it's going to be pouring straight out. We saw how in Afghanistan, nothing was built that had any real substance or longevity. And partly that was a reflection of the amount of money that was just going into Afghanistan and out of it again. And that's where Ukraine is going. It is the Afghanization of Ukraine.
I wonder if there's anyone in in Europe, in the EU, that is trying to say, guys, stop this.
Yes,
Like
there
going
is.
to the polls or going or talking to the Romanians and then the Moldovans and saying, stop this.
Yes, there is one person in the EU who understands the situation extremely well, and that is Viktor Orban. But I don't think anybody wants to listen to him. And I think he's probably realized that if he comes along and gives this advice, all that's going to happen is he's going to be shouted down. So I think, perhaps wisely, he's biding his time.
All right, we'll leave it there. This is not going to be an overnight thing. It's going to take a couple of weeks
No,
to develop,
it is.
if it is even going to develop.
Absolutely. I mean, one would like to hope that, there are sane people in Washington, especially, who will be able to bring a stop to this. But, you mentioned Lloyd Austin. I mean, I saw him again in Kiev. I mean, the trouble is, this man is wildly overpromoted amongst all the sort of military leaders that you could find. He seems almost the least capable. I mean, again, to say it simply, he's not the sharpest knife in the drawer. And, there may be all kinds of clever people, far cleverer people than Lloyd Austin in the Pentagon. But ultimately, is he going to listen to them, or is he going to listen to people like Blinken and Sullivan and Nuland and all of those?
And Blinken and Sullivan aren't exactly the sharpest knives in the drawer
No, they're
either.
not.
So
They're not.
blind
No, they're
leading the
not.
blind.
It's the blind leading the blind. But they have an arrogant self-confidence that leads them and everyone else to disaster. Mhm.
All right, we'll leave it there. The Duran.locals.com, everybody, and go to the Duran shop. 10% off when you use the code. Good day. Take care.